The signs of slaughter didn't stop as Weiss and Blake rushed further down the train. If anything, they got worse, with bloody handprints on the walls and doors. Weiss's teeth ground together as she did her best to ignore it all and force herself onwards. They still hadn't found Jaune. They had to find him. "Whatever's doing this is using their weapons against them," Blake said. "I know. Grimm don't use weapons, Weiss. I know. Jaune doesn't have his— I know!" Weiss snapped. She clenched her eyes shut and shook her head. I know what this means, Blake. It was a massacre at the docks too," her teammate whispered. "He tore through them like they were nothing more than paper. He didn't even hesitate." A ragged breath left her as she tried to control her thoughts. She shook her head again, not in denial, but more to rid herself of the scent that clung to her nostrils. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "I know what this means. I'm not an idiot, Blake." "I know you're not, Weiss," Blake said, as she opened another door for them to rush through. "It's just— I know what he can do. I've seen it before. I didn't want you to go in blind, to not know what to expect and to say or do something bad." Irritation flashed through her, followed by a frustrated growl that slipped past her lips. "Do you think this is going to change anything?" she asked. "Do you think I'm not going to want him as a partner before? Or that it would change how I feel? Is that what you're worried about?" Blake looked at her for a long moment, before the girl chuckled. "I guess I was just being stupid." "You are," Weiss agreed, a tinge of anger in her voice. "Jaune is my partner before anything else. I knew that he killed before, back when he saved you. This is a shock, I'll admit, but it's not going to change the way I see him. I just wanted to be sure, Weiss. You wanted to make sure I wouldn't hurt him," Weiss countered. "That I wouldn't say something that would cause him distress." "Perhaps," Blake admitted. "I didn't mean anything by it, but it's fine, Blake." Weiss said. It was okay. Blake was closest to him, especially after he saved her life. So it made sense she would prioritize him over her. Weiss felt she should have been offended at that, but she wasn't. It felt good to know someone cared for him so. "It's more than fine," she whispered. "Let's bring him home, Blake." Their feet echoed against the steel carriage as they dashed forward, followed every now and then by a splash as they stepped in something she'd rather not notice. Up ahead, there was the sound of combat. Weiss's heart hammered in her chest as she increased her pace. He was close. He was so close. Blake sped up too, and they both crashed into the room around the same time. He was there, Jaune, on his knees, knelt over a figure that struggled to move. Torchwick saw them too, his green eyes wide with panic. "I surrender," he yelled. "Just get him off me." He surrendered? They'd done it. Weiss felt a rush of joy, only for it to die an ugly breath as Jaune pushed Torchwick's cane aside and raised his dagger into the air. One swing is all it would take to end the criminal's life, and to her horror, the knife descended. "No!" Weiss cried. Her arms were wrapped under his shoulders before she could even think about it. All she knew was that she had to stop him, just to stop him from killing someone who had already surrendered. He roared like a wild animal. She struggled to hold on, but cried out as his elbow slammed into her face. She staggered back and fell, one hand cupped to her cheek as she looked up to Jaune with teary eyes. He turned and swung at her, bloody dagger flashing in the air. "Jaune?" she whispered. The blade stopped. It was but a few inches from her face, so close that she could see her frightened reflection on it. Sweat ran down her brow as her eyes traced up the knife, his arm, and then towards his face. Jaune's face was matted with blood, soot, bruises, and dirt. His lip was swollen and one eye was clenched shut, the other crisscrossed with red veins. His beautiful eyes were bloodshot and raw. There was madness in it, a raw, visceral fury, like a wild animal who had been hurt and it had no idea what it was doing, only that it needed to protect itself. Through all that, however, she could also see recognition. He knew her. Her heart broke. Heedless of the weapon and of all the blood and gore, she reached up to touch his cheek. "It's me," she whispered. "It's Weiss. Your partner." "Weiss." His voice was weak and scratchy, as though he screamed at horse long ago. "That's right." She laughed, more from relief than any true humor. She reached out to touch his hand with her fingers. She didn't have to tug the knife out of it. He let it slip free of his own volition. "You're safe now," she said. "We're going to be okay." If he lives. Torchwick laughed. "Remember, kids, don't do drugs." "That's enough out of you," Blake snarled, echoing Weiss's thoughts perfectly as she strode over and stomped down onto his face. The crook was knocked out, his cane falling limply to his side. In her arms, she felt Jaune stir to move towards it. "Stay," she urged, keeping him still. "He's given up, Jaune. It's over." "Is he?" Blake hovered nearby, having abandoned her prisoner to come and check on her teammate, or father figure, whichever counted. "Jaune, can you hear me? It's... Blake." "Ah." Blake's amber eyes sparkled. The smile that took over her face was watery, perhaps the closest Weiss had ever come to seeing her teammate cry. "Yes," she whispered. "It's me. Thank God you're still there. I thought you were going to die because you saved me." His eyes clenched shut as she leaned forward and grabbed his forehead. His skin was pale, but now that she looked more closely, covered in sweat. She could feel him shaking in her arms. "He's still in bad shape. We need to bring the train to a stop and administer first aid." What kind? She had no idea. This was a little beyond bandaging a cut-up. "Blake, you see to stopping this thing and then..." A siren cut off her words. The entire cabin drenched in red light. "About that," Blake gasped, eyes looking over their heads. "I think we've run out of track." Weiss's heart leapt into her throat as she looked forward to see one of the computer screens Blake pointed to. It showed a wall of rubble rapidly approaching. They were going to crash. They were going to hit the city. "Get close!" Weiss yelled, pulling her weapon free as she focused on creating an ice shield for them. She pulled Jaune's face into her shoulder, feeling his fevered flesh on her own as the defensive shield crept to life. It only got halfway when the world exploded. "Weiss! Weiss! Get up!" Something was shaking her. She could feel a hand on her shoulder, even as stones dug deep into her skin and something warm washed over her back. With a groan, Weiss cracked eyes open and stirred. What happened?" "The train hit Vale." Blake whispered and helped her sit up. "Your barrier lessened some of the impact, but it wasn't enough to keep everything together. Are you okay?" A good question. Was she? Weiss looked down at herself, but all her limbs were attached. Her body arched and stung, but it was more from bruised muscle and little scrapes and scratches than anything else. "I'm fine," she said. "What about Jaune? Where is he?" "We were separated. I only just found you." "Again?" "But we just found him." "He can't be far, Weiss. But we've got some more immediate problems to worry about." A howl cut through the air, and now that she paid attention, she could hear screams and cries too, as civilians fled the scene and called for help. The hole they caused, where Twisted wrecked pulled from, had yet to disgorge the grim, but it was clear they were close. Battered and bruised, Wise forced herself to stand and face it. Her weapon shook slightly in her hand. "We hold them here," Wise said. "We can't let the Grim run rampant in the city." "What about Yang and Jaune?" "They have to be nearby, Blake. If they're hurt or injured, then holding the Grim back would give them the best chance of survival." The faunus nodded and drew her weapon. Together, they limped towards the breach, prepared for whatever might come forth. They didn't have to wait long. It was like a tidal wave of black, as shapes poured forth and looped across the ruined train. There were so many, and only two of them. But Weiss squared her shoulders and prepared for the worst. The carpet of black shapes surged towards them. Weiss moved only to meet them, only to be blown back as the dark shape whirled overhead. Lightning erupted, despite the clear sky. It took the heiress a second to place the deafening sound. "Weiss!" Blake gasped. "Look!" A bullhead tore through the air above the plaza, its twin cannons whirring as it unleashed a hail of brutal fire on the massed creatures. They died in the doves, but kept coming. No single bullhead could hold them back, but that wasn't what brought a spark of hope to Weiss's heart. One bullhead meant someone had noticed, and that meant help might be coming. They were going to be saved. "Yeah!" A familiar voice reached their ears, echoed by the sound of blast of fire. Blake shared one look with Weiss before the dark-haired girl was off, sprinting towards it. Weiss followed, heart pounding in her chest as they crested a large pile of rubble and looked down into the other side. Yang Xiaolong looked back. "Hey guys," she laughed. "Nice to see you made it." "Head in the game, niece," Crow Brandman cautioned, his back to her. The huntsman was as bedraggled as they were, but projected an aura of confidence around him. "Get over here, you two," he called. "Ice Princess, where's your boyfriend?" I don't know. He was right there with us, but..." "Jaune was in the ice barrier with you," Blake pointed out. "Were he dead, his body would have been beside yours." The dark-haired girl smiled. "Therefore, he has to be alive." "You're right," Weiss nodded. "We just have to find him. Again. He's fast becoming a hassle. When we get him back, we'll need to put a leash on him." "Oh, I bet you'd like that," Yang laughed. "Is this really the time for jokes?" Blake asked, the four of them forming a circle as the Grimm surrounded them. "Blake, this is the exact time for jokes." "Can't say I disagree." Crow mumbled. "Just wish yours were any good." "Did the old man just say something?" The old man's response was to cut off a group of Beowulfs lunged towards them. Crow met them halfway, cutting down one with a strike as he engaged a third, all to buy them more time. Weiss swayed out of the way of the claws of one and traced a line across its throat with her weapon. Sweat dropped down her hair, the steady beat of her heart in her own ears. They'd been fighting for so long. She wasn't sure how much she had left. Explosions and gunfire in the distance gave her hope. Grim didn't use weapons, nor did fleeing civilians. It sounded like the cavalry was on the way. They just needed to hold on. With a frustrated growl, she lunged forward to pierce the throat of a large Ursa. It swung at her with its arms, but she was able to draw out and duck beneath them. "Weiss, behind you!" Yang yelled. A Beowulf lunged at her unprotected back, its claws reaching for her face. She tried to pedal back in panic, but tripped over the still dissolving corpse of the Ursa. Her weapon flashed before her, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to stop its weight landing upon her, crushing her. She forced her eyes to remain open, to fight to the end. The monster froze. It stood on its hind legs, hands held forward, but snout tilted downwards towards its own chest. The tip of a blade was visible through it, though it reacted before their eyes. There was a roar of anger as it swung back and severed the creature's neck. The monster fell to the side, to reveal an altogether different monster behind it. Weiss choked on her relief. He was okay. He was alive. Jaune. Weiss. That voice! Weiss looked back in time to see a white-garbed figure dart down a section of rubble. And Ursa dared to stand in her path, but was cut down by a silvery saber. The tall woman twisted to the side and decapitated another, before summoning a flock of silvery birds to drive 5 back. Winter! Weiss laughed, shoulders going slack. And not just her sister. Students poured out behind her, the uniform of Beacon the most prominent, but others mixed among them. Peter port-bellied his 5th, dashing through a horde of Grimm with his strange weapon in tow, while Oblek cut through a Borba tusk with a mere, methodical approach. More poured from the bridge itself, but half of those were cut down as one of the train's carriages was levitated and thrown at them. Never thought I'd be glad to see Miss Goodwitch looking so pissed. Yang laughed. The blonde caught sight of someone else and whooped, "Hey, Ruby!" Yang. The girl in red waved back. Weiss couldn't help it. Maybe it was the relief as pure and sweet as crystalline water, or maybe it was her own fear, now thrown back in her face. Whatever the case, it was impossible to not let out a pearl of laughter. They'd done it. They were going to win, and all get out safely. How Beacon had reacted so quickly to the disaster, she had no idea. But it meant none of them would die, and that was an idea she could get behind. The students didn't push the Grimm back. They slaughtered them. There were too many, and the reaction to the disaster was too quick. The black wave was cut down before it had a chance to spread out into the city, and as their numbers dwindled, Weiss saw Miss Goodwitch stride forward and seal the breach herself, forcing what must have been several tons of rubble into it. From start to finish, it took a few minutes, but the silence that hung over the plaza afterwards was deafening. Sirens howled in the background, but they would arrive only in time to clean up the mess. Weiss staggered and nearly fell, if not for Blake catching her. "I've got you," the faunus said. "I'm glad someone has. This has been quite the day. I think we could all do a day off for this." Yang agreed. Before that, though, she added, eyes hard. "Jaune, you were going straight to the infirmary. If you try and pull off any more bullshit over that..." She left the threat hanging, but Weiss and Blake more than echoed it with their own stern glares. Jaune didn't move. He remained standing, his chest heaving as he had twitched from side to side. His eyes were wild. An unsettling feeling pulled in her stomach. "Jaune?" she asked. "What's wrong?" "Yang!" Ruby's voice reached them as her and various other students approached. "Are you all okay? Why are you all just standing there?" The small girl was flanked by her team, but also others, including Miss Goodwitch and her sister. Their weapons were sheathed, the grim threat dealt with. Why did Jaune still have his drawn? Weiss's eyes widened when she saw, almost in slow motion. His head turned towards Ruby's voice. Her breath caught as she saw his muscles tense, his wild eyes go wide. "Look out!" She had only the time to scream, before Jaune dashed forward and swung down towards them. "Whoa!" Ruby cried out and darted to the side, as did many others as her partner, her teammate and friend, lashed out among his allies. Pyrrha grabbed Ruby and pulled her back, but Jaune turned the other way and tried to cut the head off a silver-haired young man. The student dodged back, but Jaune seemed to lose interest the moment he did. He lunged at a woman instead, his blade narrowly missing her throat. "He's gone insane!" someone yelled. Students scattered, and Weiss's heart fell as she saw Winter draw her blade and move toward him. She was about to chase after her sister to prevent her, if not for Jaune's body going unnaturally still. His arms clamped to his sides. Even if he kept hold of his weapon still, Miss Goodwitch strode forward, her crop aimed towards him. Even restrained, his head tossed back and forth as he struggled to break free. "Mr. Ark, if you do not desist, I'll be forced to use violence to make you," the woman threatened. Weiss gasped and climbed clumsily over some rubble. "Wait," she cried. "Don't hurt him." "Miss Snee?" The imposing teacher turned to her, crop still pointed towards the crazed student. "Stay back. There is something wrong with Mr. Ark." "Don't hurt him," Weiss repeated. "He's not himself. He doesn't know what's going on." "Excuse me?" "He was drugged," Blake explained, coming to a stop beside her. "Torchwick captured him in the mission and pumped him full of drugs. Jaune, he doesn't know what's going on around him. This isn't his fault." Miss Goodwitch clicked her teeth together but didn't relent. She looked at the struggling blonde with a weary eye, but sighed. Even so, I can't let the three of you go near him. If Mr. Ark has lost control, he could harm those around him. He will need to be subdued." "Subdued? But he was already so weak and hurt. Any more and he might be badly hurt. His aura was low and there was blood from a wound in his side. And if he couldn't even feel the pain, then how much would it take to bring him down? A broken leg or two? Worse?" "Weiss, get back here," Winter roared. She wouldn't, not when her partner was like this. She ducked under her sister's attempt to grab her, slipped past Miss Goodwitch and knocked Pyrrha down when she tried. Her eyes were locked onto him, his struggling form as he thrashed his head left and right, confined within the deputy's semblance. "He's breaking loose," Miss Goodwitch warned. "I cannot keep this up forever." "Weiss, stop," Winter ordered. "He's not in his right mind. He's dangerous." Weiss grit her teeth against her anger. How dare they? How dare they act like they knew more about him than she did? He was dangerous. She knew that. She'd seen his handiwork first person. He was far more dangerous than they even realized. But that didn't matter. "He's my partner!" she shouted back, crossing the final distance and stumbling towards him. Her legs were tired, her lungs tortured for breath. But she still managed to stay standing long enough to collapse against his chest. The teacher's hold on him snapped too, and Jaune's arm broke free as he hefted his sword once more. Had he reclaimed it from Blake? She couldn't recall. It didn't matter. Her eyes were locked onto the others, onto the students of Team Reuben. But before he could take a step forward, she reached up to cup his face between her hands. He resisted, but she dragged his face down to look at her. Anger, rage, pain, fear. She saw all that and more in his eyes, normally so littered, lazy, and teasing. They always looked as though he were privy to some joke she couldn't understand. Now, that barrier was gone, and he looked lost and alone. "I'm here," she whispered. "It's me." Her breath was heavy, eyes still locked to the side, towards those who he had attacked. His hands tightened around the hilt of his weapon, but she simply rubbed his cheeks between her hands. "Jaune," she crooned. "It's me, Weiss. We're back in Vale now." Slowly, torturously, his eyes moved to hers. Weiss's heart broke to see the evidence of such violent torture across his face. The face of a man who kissed her. He looked far more handsome then. Now he was wounded and battled, covered in dirt and blood. She rubbed some of it away with her thumb. A lone tear trailed down her cheek. "Weiss," his voice slurred, drunken almost. "Is that you? You're not an illusion?" An illusion? Was that what he thought? She couldn't make heads or tails of it. But then again, neither could he. It was the drugs talking. "Who else would put up with you?" she teased, her voice weak. She heard footsteps approach, and didn't need to look to know who they belonged to. "Not just me though. There's Blake and Yang too," Of course. Yang laughed. Did you think something would happen to us? Huh, have a little faith. I'm here too, Blake added, but said no more. His arms lowered. She felt the tension in him drain, his body stumbling just a little. Yang caught it, propping him up with one shoulder. Blake took the other, worried eyes trailing up and down her teammate's body. I thought, he gasped for breath. I thought you died. Again. Again? Yang asked, but Blake shook her head for the girl to be silent. Now wasn't the time to confuse him. I wouldn't let anything happen to them. Weiss said, drawing his fading attention back to her. They're my girls, after all. What kind of mother would I be if I let them get hurt? You... He stared at her. Perhaps her, or perhaps through her. You didn't call them that before. Well, that's what they are, isn't it? They always call us their parents. Only in this life. He blinked and struggled for a second. This is real, isn't it? This isn't one of her illusions. Her? Weiss ignored the question and grabbed his cheeks tighter to show him just how real she was. This is real, Jaune. We completed the mission. We're back in Vale. We're back home. It's over now. Over. His head fell and low, ragged chuckle escaped him. It's not over. Not yet. It is for now, Jaune. Sleep, recover, and come back to us. I'm afraid, he whispered. If I close my eyes, I'll die. And none of this would have mattered. It will all go away. Jaune. Weiss had to pause to swallow. We'll still be here when you wake, Jaune. You? He swayed, voice even more slurred. Do you promise? I promise. He collapsed between them. Weiss pressed her forehead against his, tears in the corner of her eyes as she heard the teachers yell and run in. He would be okay. She told herself he would have the best treatment, the best that money could buy, and then more so if necessary. I promise, she repeated, stroking his bloody hair with one hand. Cinder turned away from the dramatic display and moved towards the ruins. Fools. Their petty emotions interested her little. Far more important was the continuation of her plans, which that idiot Roman had seen fit to compromise. General Ironwood had not arrived. He would not for a few more days. An emotion she was not used to feeling swarmed about inside her. It took her a few moments to realize it was frustration. And over what? It had been a long time since one of her plans had been ruined in such a manner. No matter. They may have their victory here. All it will serve is to make them overconfident and to drive more hatred against the Faunus. This terrorist act would be on the news soon enough, and all the white-fanged bodies that littered the plaza made it clear who was responsible. In turn, the people would turn their grief and anger onto innocent Faunus, driving them to Adam's ranks, and thus boosting her own. Even in victory, they would sow the seeds of their own defeat. The irony was delicious. Before any of that, however, she needed to see to placing her pawn where he could make the greatest difference. His instructions had been to find and engage her, or her lackeys, but he failed to do so. Honestly, it was expected by now. She would just need to do things herself. A quick nod to Mercury and Emerald had them fan out, to search for the errant thief and arrest him. The good reputation they would get for doing so would be a nice touch. But if she knew General Ironwood like she thought she did, there was only one place the paranoid man would feel safe incarcerating dear Roman, and that would give her access to all his delightful little toys. The thought of it was enough to bring a smile back to her face. If any who saw it thought it odd, they likely attributed it to the heartwarming display between the young Schnee and her irritating partner. Idly, she touched her hand against her throat. There was no wound, but his attack had come dangerously close. His eyes had been wild and dangerous, focused on her. What an interesting individual. "Ma'am," Emerald whispered, off to the side. "I found him." "Good," Cinder said, striding over some masonry. "Pick him up and take him to the professors. I'm sure they will transfer him to Ironwood in time." "I don't think they will," Mercury said. Confusion. Another unfamiliar sensation washed over her. She shoved past the silver-haired teen and knelt by Emerald. With a cautious hand, she pushed the girl aside. Roman Torchwick stared back up at her. His eyes were lifeless.